Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again for the 2 and 2 podcast. Again, here with our pastor, Blake Switzer. And so we're so excited to be able to give you all some encouragement and dive into some things that are really important to us individually, important to us as a church as well. And just remember, you can tune in on all our social media platforms. You can watch us on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe bell as well. And you can also listen to us on Spotify. But thank you again for tuning in. And this month's podcast is about why leadership matters. And so, Blake, as we dive into that, it's been a really important topic for some time now for us as a staff. It's been a really important topic that we've have done a lot more leadership things with our volunteers here at the church as well. So we have our Connect conference coming up here in about a week and a half. And it's going to all focus on leadership and how to grow as a leader. And we see that as such an important aspect of our church and growing and being able to invest in people. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that matters. And so first, I want to dive into scripturally, why that matters so much. And we talked a little bit about that this week. And so why does that matter from a scripture point of view?
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, you see, I think looking at the life of Jesus, obviously, is where we ought to start. And so, his plan from the very beginning was to develop leaders. I mean, he took the 12, he invested in even a smaller group of 3 from those 12. And so just from the get-go, he knew his time on earth was limited, and he was discipling, is another way of saying that, or developing leaders who could lead in his absence. So, I mean, I think that in and of itself is enough. There's a lot of other places and a lot of other scripture, but I think starting with the example of Jesus is always a good place to begin.
Yeah, I think the things that stood out to me, just a few things of just being a leader and having people learn from your example. And so, the story of Jesus healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law, and just them being able to witness that and seeing the fullness of the power of who Jesus is.
Right.
You see.
Do you think Peter was excited? By the way,
I don't know.
Mother-in-law was healed.
I would be excited if it was my mother-in-law.
Good answer.
I don't know about you. If Karen Williams, if you're watching, I'd be glad that you were healed. Just thinking through that of like allowing people to see in fullness of who you are as a leader.
Right.
That's an extreme example that Jesus, is documented there. But you see that trickle out with the 12 disciples. You see it as he sends out the 72 to go and let other people know. And you see that investment start to spread. And when leaders develop leaders after leaders, and we're in that line of leaders that have invested in us because of what Jesus has done as well. And there's evidence of that lasting impact. And so that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the passages that has been most impactful to me is actually an Old Testament passage, but in the book of Exodus, where Moses, was basically trying to do everything on his own. People were coming to him. Yeah. He was the one who had been given instructions by God, and they would come and say, what does the law say about this? And Moses was the judge over all the people. And in Exodus 18, I guess we have an in-law theme going here a little bit, don't we? But his father-in-law came to him, and it says, when his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, what is this you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? So you get this picture. All these people are just standing there waiting for their case to be heard. They're really not getting what they need. I can imagine, I know how much I don't like standing in line for 5 minutes. You can imagine standing around all day waiting for Moses. And his father-in-law looks at it kind of as an outsider and just says, what are you thinking? And his response, of course, is, well, the people come to me. And verse 17 says, Moses' father-in-law replied, what you're doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. And then he goes through and gives them instructions. This is what you need to do. Divide them up into smaller groups and put leaders over the smaller groups. But that's really essentially what he said, is if you want to be more effective leading the people, you're going to have to raise up other leaders who can lead other leaders who can lead people. And that's always been a impactful passage for me, because I could kind of relate, you know, to what he was going through there.
Well, especially just as our church has grown over the past several years, and the need to have more leaders in place and relying on others and,
Yeah.
and duplicating ourselves.
Yeah.
That need's been there. How much has that played an impact of why we've put such a premium on leadership in
Yeah.
our staff and in our church?
Well, it's probably more than it should, actually, because sometimes we find ourselves waiting until we're in a pinch, you know?
Right.
And it's kind of like, okay, now I have to do something. And so looking back, I wish that we'd had more, been more proactive about it earlier on, you know, rather than, okay, now there's really no option. I mean, we have to do that. We've long since grown past the point that a few people could handle all that goes on in the church. But I do think there's a lot of wisdom and that's kind of where we're at right now, is how do we get ahead of that so that, you know, we're putting things in place now and not just trying to fill the needs that we have right now, but how to, you know, filling needs that will help us reach people in the future and
Yeah.
grow. And I think where everybody is individually, that's something we probably all can relate to. You know,
Yeah.
we get so caught up in the day-to-day and how do I make it today, as opposed to thinking about how do I develop leaders for the future. And that can be tough to do when you're, you know, if you're trying to run around, put out fires and things
Yep.
like that today, it can be a little difficult, but it sure is important.
Yeah, it's extremely important. Like you said, just even in the season of COVID, where we had to switch everything and how we communicated, how
Right.
we had services, how we did everything. It was going to take more people, and it wasn't just going to be able to fall on a few.
Right.
And you know, I think it's neat for me is when you have people in a place where they're consumed with who Jesus is. There's a season when you as a leader, you're duplicating yourself. There's a season when you're being led by a leader, and different areas and different seasons of life kind of put you in those things. But it's just so important. So what are some other determining factors that went in place as we've, as far as leadership development for our staff,
Yeah.
leadership development for our volunteers? What are some other things that kind of sparked that as this is something that we need to focus on?
I think some of it was just discovering the benefit personally, you know, and coming across different resources, different podcasts. We did a staff retreat, I guess, what was it, a little over a year ago, maybe, and we focused just on being poured into as leaders, you know, and we watched some YouTube leadership stuff and things like that. So I think some of that is just the practical, seeing the impact that it's had on me individually, seeing the impact that it's had on our staff. Some of that is you know, things that I've known for a while, but just getting it put into place. But I think a lot of it's just seeing that this is encouraging, and it helps me think differently, and it helps our staff think differently, and it equips us to really to become better leaders, because, you know, we talk about it all day, but
Right.
we've got to have some plan for how do we grow in our leadership.
Yeah, I think that's something that's been so impactful for me, and we'll talk about some of these resources here in a few minutes, is just weekly you'll assign podcasts for us to go through, and the nuggets that come out of those podcasts, you know, is huge. It's either it affirms some things that
Right.
we've done as leaders, or it's like this is something we need to do, or this is something where I'm lacking in my leadership.
Yeah.
And I feel like I discover one of those two things every single week.
Right.
And it's extremely impactful. And then being in that mindset, something that I've also loved is just different book recommendations that's come
Right.
out of our staff,
Yeah.
whether it's reading Founder's Mentality or just even, it wasn't a leadership book, it was an evangelism book, but just saying this is the direction we want to go as a staff, so we're going to
Yep.
read out of the Salt Shaker
Right.
and to see how that grows us, and to be sharpened by one another. We're with each other almost every single day in
Right.
a week as a staff, and we have a staff meeting that we're able to implement that. So I want to talk a few minutes about what does that look like with volunteers that you're not with face to face every single day. What does it look like to lead volunteers and to point them in a direction where we feel like we want to go?
Right. And I think that's a good question, and it's a challenge to figure out the best way to do that. But ultimately, it does come back to some type of relational investment. You know, I know that as you grow, you can't spend time individually with everybody. but it's figuring out where to invest. In fact, I was just thinking as we were talking about that not too long ago, we, for the first time, pulled together a group of women in our church that are leading in different areas and said, okay, we're going to go through 6 different weeks of just a different podcast each week and talk about that. Well, I saw one of those ladies yesterday as I was headed into the gym, and we were talking about something, and she was asking me about something about my schedule and whatever, and we're talking about it. She said, "You got that off one of those podcasts, didn't you?" And I said, "I sure did." She knew exactly where it had come from, and I think of things like that where you can hear something, and in this particular case, it had to do with schedules, and how to arrange things and what to do early in the morning and what to do later in the day, and how all that works together, and just kind of talking through that. But seeing the impact that those, being able to take something and actually do something with it is, I think, where it gets real encouraging. But back to your question, how do we do that? I think we have to just focus on who are those people that God has given me in my particular sphere of influence. And I would encourage those that are, folks that are watching, listening to this podcast, is just to think of it that way. Who are those people? I think it starts at home. That's a great place to begin, and your family, and start there. But then beyond that, maybe it's not a church setting. It may be in an office setting, or maybe it is in your ministry or whatever it is. But just who are those people that I have a relationship with that I can, kind of encourage and pass some things along to, and maybe even say, hey, would you be interested in, let's sit down for a few weeks and go through some of this stuff together, or whatever it may be. But I think you have to seek it out. It doesn't just happen.
Yeah. It's being intentional, I think, is the key with everything, especially when it comes to leadership, whether you're trying to develop new leaders, whether you're investing in the leaders you have, or whether you're changing the direction of where you're wanting to go. It's doing everything with a purpose is huge. And I think investing in those leaders and being intentional, and I think also seeing them with the qualities that they have. Like, God has equipped all of us so uniquely to do something very, very different, but for the same purpose. And I often find myself in a place where I'm leading over a ministry with people that are leading those ministries that are way smarter than me, way smarter than I will ever be, and they're doing an incredible job. And part of my role in developing them as a leader is continue to be their biggest cheerleader and encouraging them and things like that. So I think that's one of the major things that I'm excited about, that leadership development has been such a important part of our church, not only staff, but lay leaders in our church as well, is to see what God is doing through the individuals of our church is such an incredible thing, and being intentional about it has been huge.
And you bring up a great point there. Part of that, and actually listened to this yesterday in the podcast. We'll talk about this next week in our staff meeting. But one of the points that they made that really was a great reminder to me was part of leading and developing leaders is sometimes you got to back out of the way as well. And that can be a difficult thing to do when you're used to calling the shots, or you have a certain idea of, I think this is how it should be done, or whatever. But to be at a place to say, okay, I'm going to pour into other people, but I'm also going to take a step back sometimes. Not always easy, but it's important.
That's really hard, and it's hard for me to do. It was hard, especially stepping into my new role a few years ago, but just seeing what happens when you do, of just seeing re-engage start and regeneration and foster love.
Because it's like you said, people are out there that are more gifted, smarter than we are, that can do things better, but you'll never know that until you
turn it loose.
Get out of the way and turn it loose. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, we've talked about why, scripturally, why leadership is important, investing in others. We've talked about why it's been important for our staff and our volunteers. I'm so excited for the Connect Conference and being able to go in on a deeper level with some of this. It's one of the things I love when Connect Conference comes around, to be able to do that. But let's talk about some resources that have been extremely beneficial for us individually and just for our staff and volunteers, some things that we've recommended. So what are some things that you really depend on?
Well, I'll start, obviously, Scripture is a foundation for everything, and I think that's where we begin. But as far as supplemental types of resources, there have been some podcasts that have been really meaningful for us lately. I think some of the key ones, the Watermark Church Leadership podcasts, are always excellent. Love those. Gotten a lot of good material from that. Craig Groeschel's leadership podcasts have been really good. We've gone through several of those. We did a few of one called At the Table by Patrick Lencioni, who is kind of a mix of secular / a little bit of Christian. But so it's been, to me, I enjoy getting perspective from a variety of, I want to hear it from a Christian perspective for sure, but I also kind of want to know what's working in the business world. And, I think there's things that we can learn from others. But so those podcasts have been helpful for me as resources. What about for you? What are some things that are...
just mention that, not even just the Watermark podcast, but just Watermark Church in and of itself has been very influential through their church leaders conference. Has really helped even us develop the Connect conference and what it's has turned into. And I think that's been such a great influence for me and any church leader in our church to listen to that podcast. I think we'll find a lot of really helpful information there. The John Maxwell leadership podcast is really good. It's a little bit more long-winded at times, but it's really, really good. And for me, I get a lot of nuggets out of books. And I know you mentioned it in a previous sermon here recently of just the impact reading can make, and that the average person reads 12 books a year. And I try to juggle that as well, of just some spiritual uplifting things to read, but also just what's working in the business world. And about 1.5 years ago, I read a book called Procrastinate on Purpose, and it helped me kind of organize my schedule where I can be more effective for the kingdom and also be more effective at home in my ministry there as well. And so that's been extremely helpful, and so I highly recommend that as well. And the book that you recommended, Founder's Mentality, that we mentioned before, was really, really good. So there's a lot of good books out there. There's a lot of good podcasts. And I think a lot of it is carving out the time to be able to absorb that information that's out there.
So how do you do that? I'm just curious. What does that look like for you?
So I think it goes back to that word being intentional. So charting out my week at the beginning of the week to know when I have the time, to know the appointments that I have, and to know the windows of opportunity that I have to listen to podcasts. Mondays are a lot of really good personal equipping time for me. That's how it kind of pans out. And so Mondays, when I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of do some reading there, and then throughout the week as well, there's different times that I have carved out. But I think it's really important to be intentional about it. Otherwise, it becomes something you just do for a little bit.
Yep, absolutely.
How about you? How do you?
Well, it's funny. My biggest time is when I'm at the gym, believe it or not. But when I'm on doing exercise, something I love to either read or listen to podcasts there, and so that I find that to be a good time. I sometimes struggle with the day to in the office kind of thing. It tends to be more outside of the office that I try to find time to do that. So, but I think what you touched on is a good thing of just being intentional about setting some of those times aside and making it a priority, because otherwise it doesn't always
it's
happen.
a struggle. Like it's hard to read. I'll read in the evenings at home a lot, but with 3 very young kids in the house, like I've tried, and having to be intentional about when and where as well. And that leads me to another tip, and just had a conversation recently with Lynn about this of she uses Audible a lot, so she uses audiobooks. And if that's how you absorb information better, like I just highly encourage using those tools and resources. We live in an age where at our fingertips, we have some of the most amazing theologians, some of the most amazing pastors, some of the most amazing authors, and we don't have to carve out time to go to a library. We don't have to look for transcripts. Like it's a Google search away. Be intentional about who you're listening to and know who you're listening to, but use those resources like Audible if that's what works for you. I highly recommend that.
Absolutely, and I say especially for people that are in their cars. That's another thing. If I'm driving, it's 7 minutes to get from home to church, but if I'm going somewhere or on the road, I try to take advantage of that time to listen and learn. And so
awesome. Well, Blake, thanks again for this opportunity and again, investing in me as a leader, investing in our staff as a leader. You do a really great job. And through you being intentional, I feel like it's grown a lot of us well. And I'm so excited that y'all get to tune in and see even a different side of your pastor and myself and just some things that we find important. So again, You can listen to us on Spotify. You can watch this podcast on Facebook and YouTube as well. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. But I hope you all have a great week, and thank you again for tuning in to the 2 and 2 podcast.